everybody. If you're in India, and good evening, good night if you're joining us from other parts of the world. We welcome you all to this conversation with authors at the release of the book uh, from the Philosophy of Education Conference Proceedings. So let me quickly set the context for all of you to understand why are we having this conversation with authors. Um, the Philosophy of Education Conference that started in 2013. It's an international conference. It ran till 2017, and it was started by Azim Premji University to respond to the shrinking space of philosophy in the educational landscape. So the university, which comes under the Azim Premji Foundation at large, wanted to bring back philosophy into the educational landscape and infuse the, the, the landscape of practice with philosophical thinking as well. This was the reason this conference was set up, and then for 5 years it ran with participants from all over the globe coming in, talking about education, presenting philosophical ideas on how education can change, what needs to be done, and several other important things. Now, what we are doing right now is that we have basically released all of these talks, papers in a book format, and we want to continue holding these conversations and not let them just die in one event, right? So this is the context behind the conversation with authors that we are planning to have now. So I welcome you all again to this. And in today's conversation, we have two very important authors with us. So that is Professor Rohit Dhankar and Professor Elizabeth Rata. I've known Professor Rohit Dhankar for 10 years now. He's been my teacher, he's been my colleague, he's also been my mentor and my supervisor here at Azim University. And his work in the Indian education system is quite well known for many people who are from India. A quick round of introduction of Professor Rohit Dhankar. He's a professor of philosophy of education at Azim Premji University, Bangalore. His association with the Azim Premji Foundation goes back about 2 decades. He's been part of many initiatives in developing material and curriculum through various committees and collaborative efforts across the country. His interest in curriculum for school education and teacher education resulted in collaboration with NCERT and SCRTs. His interest in educational studies resulted in a collaboration with TISS and several NGOs in developing MA education program of TISS Bombay. He taught the philosophy of education course in TISS Bombay and philosophy of education and curriculum studies at Azim Premji University, Bangalore. His history is also very interesting. He was trained as a teacher under David Horsberg in the Neilbach School and taught at the elementary level for about 15 years in a school that he opened with the help of Mr. Jitendra Pal Singh and Ms. Faith Singh of Jaipur. He is the founder or secretary of Digantar. It's a voluntary organization in Jaipur engaged in providing alternative education to rural children. Digantar endeavors to nurture self-motivated and independent learners equipped with the ability to think critically. His formal education is a graduation in science and master's in mathematics, and he was educated in several indifferently functioning government schools in rural Rajasthan. So a very warm welcome to Professor Rohit Dhankar. Professor Elizabeth Rata is a sociologist of education and a professor in the School of Critical Studies in Education at the Faculty of Education at the University of Auckland. She is director of the Knowledge in Education Research Unit, where she leads the Knowledge Rich School project. This project is using the curriculum design coherence model for teachers in their course design and in professional development programs. Her post-PhD research was into the effects of ethnic politics on educational change. For the last decade, her research has been concerned with bringing back academic knowledge into education so that all students, no matter what their background, have the opportunity to succeed at school. Her research criticizes the current commitment in New Zealand education to student-led learning, innovative learning environments, and the emphasis on teachers as facilitators. A very, very warm welcome to Professor Elizabeth Rata as well. So the two topics that we'll be discussing today, starting with Professor Rohit Dhankar, his paper that he presented in one of the conferences here is on truth, harmony, and justice. And the second topic that Professor Elizabeth Rata is going to talk about is called academic knowledge and democratic politics. So I invite Professor Rohit Dhankar now to present his views for about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes, followed by Professor Elizabeth Rata for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then there will be a conversation between them both, followed by participant questions, and then for about 40-45 minutes. Okay. I hope that's okay with everybody participating here today. Thank you for hearing me out. Over to Professor Rohit Dhankar now.
Good morning, friends. I'll try to present the gist of my paper in about 10 to 12 minutes. I have jotted down a few points. Basically, I'll read them, though I'm not projecting them at this moment. That will present the basic argument I'm building in this paper. And then, of course, during the question answer, etc., we can talk more about this. My paper is in keeping with my general attempts to look at practical business of living through philosophical perspective. As far as the analysis of the theoretical level at the theoretical level goes, there is nothing much original or new in it. All I have done is putting together some well-known ideas in a manner to argue a point pertaining to political discourse in India today. And I suspect this might be pertinent to several other democratic countries world over. Basically, I'm arguing for 2 points. One, that a commitment to truth in epistemic and moral sense is essential for peace and harmony, particularly in a democratic society. And the second, that the political correctness and what Harry Frankfurt calls bullshitting are among the most inimical trends inimical to truth and therefore to peace and harmony, particularly in our society. Obviously, I don't know much about other societies and political discourse there. But basically, I'm arguing for the first point. My argument is also pretty simple, actually. This is that India is a multicultural society with mind-boggling diversity in terms of cultural tradition, language, religion, and so on. And in a democracy, people have a right to influence the socio-political situation to create a desirable society according to their own values and interests. That's a legitimate democratic right. Therefore, it is natural that there shall be interest groups in the public space which will be trying to work for their own ideals of socio-political and economic orders, resulting in many contesting forces in the public arena. And there shall be contests as well as, up to a certain extent, opposing each other and acrimony developing in this. But a democratic society also needs to have peace and harmony to progress as well as to fulfill these very aspirations of the people, which are very diverse in many ways. Now, when we talk of peace and harmony, often people take them as some kind of static and fixed situation, and often people think in Indian political discourse, it seems to me, it has been very prominent that you can sacrifice justice and up to a certain extent, and definitely truth to achieve peace and harmony. We will come to that a little bit later, but anyway, peace and harmony are not really static and fixed for all times in any given society. They are dynamically or perpetually created conditions which constantly face new problems and challenges, but at the same time, society keeps on solving them continuously. So, this is a kind of dynamic equilibrium. Thus, the aim could only be to reduce the contradictions and contesting ways of contestation to a level where harmonious functioning of democracy for a common good is not threatened. Actually, this common good is also dynamically formulated in any democratic society. You cannot formulate a fixed ideal of greatest common good in the democratic society. It keeps on changing. But at the same time, it always keeps connection with the basic principles on which the society, particularly democratic society, is constructed. Now, to build a socio-political system which are alive to such challenges and also to build rational capabilities of its people who can continuously produce ideas and practices that are operationalized through these systems. That is the kind of thing we need to look at, and how that could be preserved. Ajita, if I am taking too much time, then you can remind me, because I have forgotten what time I started. So coming back, now democracies are premised on the principle of all citizens being intrinsically worthwhile and making their informed or rather reasoned decision autonomously. That an attack on the autonomous decision of citizens is an attack on their dignity and human beings, as well as critical critical citizens of a democracy. These are the basic principles or basic assumptions I am taking. Now, autonomous and informed decision require knowledge and capabilities to reason, which includes logical capabilities as well as commitment to truth and a lot of information. Two people have argued very strongly in favor of these capabilities and knowledge in democracies. One is Mudaliar, what we call in India Mudaliar Commission, the Secondary Education Commission. While talking about aims of education, he spends a lot of time and builds a very good argument in favor of knowledge requirement and capability to think clearly in a democracy. The second is Professor White's paper, written somewhere in 1999 or 98. The paper is called New Aims for New Curriculum. That also argues for these capabilities. But I think that even without any kind of citation, these capabilities are accepted, that they are needed in a democratic citizen. Now, the argument I am trying to build on the basis of these assumptions is that attack on epistemic truth happens in several ways in political debates. When individual belief is taken and knowledge and ignoring the need for justification and truth. And much of the debate actually might go on this line. The second is when the truth is obfuscated at the level of conceptual analysis. In my paper, I have given examples of both of these things, but here, due to lack of time, I am not citing those examples from Indian political debates and educational debates. Now, the attack on moral truth is basically when the facts are either hidden or distorted or diluted in some manner or other. This is often done in the name of some public good or peace and harmony in the society. The argument I have been trying to build in this paper is But when public intellectuals, media person or media houses, and the politicians indulge in such acts, they are actually, and this is my main point, hindering the development of people into autonomous, rational decision makers. Because in society, education does this job up to a certain extent, but political discourse and political movements, uh, mm, which have impact on people's ways of thinking as well as their information level and their styles of argumentation. Dewey calls them occasions of mass education, and they also impact people's ability to think clearly and reasonably. So that is one thing. uh, when these people indulge in obfuscation, etc., they are denying them needed knowledge which forms the basis of informed decision, and in a sense they are robbing the public of their autonomy and human dignity, manipulating them into believing what they want them to believe. What I'm arguing here is that, of course, in democracy, we all have the right to try to persuade to our own opinion. But I'm trying to say uh, that the people who have large influence in the society, particularly the intellectuals and definitely the media houses, and even the politicians, have a responsibility, and that they should do this persuasion in a manner that this does not attack people's dignity and does not manipulate them. They should try to do this uh, with their commitment to the truth and justice. Now, it seems to me that this cannot be achieved. This kind of discourse cannot achieve peace and harmony in the society. Uh, Whatever short term respite it may achieve is at the cost of moral wrong and giving lease to life to perpetual strife. Actually, what I'm trying to say here is that even if at a particular time, because of certain kind of hiding facts, etc., you maintain peace for a short time, you are actually giving a lease of life to continuing strife for a very long time. Now, political correctness manifests itself. I'm arguing that political correctness is one of the biggest issues at the moment in the Indian political discourse. So, political correctness manifests itself into two interrelated forms. One is evolved form of this, and which could be said somewhat like using a language that seems intended to give the least amount of offense, especially when describing groups identity identified by external markers such as race, gender, culture, or sexual orientation, etc. This form is concerned with the sensitivity and civilized conversation and discourses. Uh, in this paper, I'm actually not talking about this form of political correctness. To my mind, this doesn't attack truth, and this is rather demand of a civilized discourse, as well as is benign and harmless to truth and justice. But there is another form of political correctness, which perhaps is its original meaning, and that is to judge the degree of compatibility of one's ideas or political analysis with the official party line, and publicly express only that which is most compatible. At the least in India, this form is practiced by all political parties and, unfortunately, by public intellectuals supporting these political parties. Uh, Political correctness in this form necessarily involves hiding, twisting, ignoring evidence and truth, and fabricating evidence, fabricating justification, and advancing lies at truth. In addition to the above mentioned dangers of lack of commitment to truth, it also throttles freedom of expression, not only in avoidance of speaking the truth, but also through intellectual attacks on those who express opinions against the accepted political lines, thus botching up debates and freedom of thinking. Uh, It is consciously directed at manipulating people and therefore, in a way, attacking their autonomy as a democratic citizen. Now, there are few lines about the conclusion, so I read them as they are in the paper at the end. Uh, Conclusion goes somewhat like this. If the above discussion has any merit, we can safely conclude that attacks on truth, epistemic as well as moral, happen in many forms. Some of them are results of laxity in epistemic standards, uh, deliberate obfuscation, plain lies, political correctness, and bullshitting. All these forms are used to manipulate people's opinion, often in the name of justice and harmony. However, any manipulation of the people's opinion constitute attack on their dignity and autonomy, uh, and therefore is morally wrong. It also constitutes an attack on rational and informed persuasion, uh, because that is the only legitimate way of creating consensus in a democracy. Manipulation, thus, is mostly unjustified. So that is moral argument. Second, and this is more of a pragmatic argument. Secondly, a frequent use of devices of manipulation creates trust deficit in the society. Lack of trust in intellectuals, politicians, media, and the state, and anyone in power in general makes smooth functioning very difficult in a society, and may invite the breakdown of law and order. Therefore, all such attempts decimate the democratic fabric of the society, even if often they are done in the name of harmony and justice, and even if initially their effects are not visible. Such devices are incapable of producing just harmony, rather than add fuel to strife and keep power struggle and animosity alive. The basic thrust of the argument, as I have said right in the beginning, is that truth and justice has to be placed in center in any attempts in a democratic society, uh, if we want lasting peace and harmony in that society. Thank you very much. I do not know whether I have taken more time than allotted to me, but I have had my say. Thank you very much, Ajita. We can go to the next speaker.
Thank you, Professor Rohit Dhankar, for that very enlightening and illuminating talk. Now we will move to Professor Elizabeth Rata.
Right, thank you, Jita. Good evening, friends in India. Good morning to you, and in other parts of the world. Now, I want to talk about the connection between knowledge and democracy. The question I have asked myself, and I'm asking you, is it possible to connect knowledge to democracy? If so, what is the nature of the connection, and what is education's role in creating the connection? Now, my proposition about this is that connecting the logic of rational knowledge and the morality of democracy is possible, but only if certain conditions, those which exist as potentialities in both rational knowledge and in democracy, are activated. And the conditions are based on universal access to rational truth-seeking knowledge, not sociocultural knowledge, for its generalizable and universalizable qualities. So that's the first condition that is essential. The second one is access to modernity's collective representations. These are the ones created in rational knowledge, because it's this knowledge which is simultaneously the instrument of thought, which is the individualizing function of the knowledge and the means of communication, which is the socializing function, ideas from Durkheim. The third condition is the democratic citizen's partial loyalty disposition, which arises from the contradictions or strife of the dialectic found in both rational knowledge and in democracy's structuring institutions. Now, these conditions of potentiality need to be activated in a public education system based on universal principles of access and provision with two things. The first, a curriculum designed according to the epistemic structuration of rational knowledge to acquire what I'm calling knowledge that, and I want to discuss knowledge that further in a minute. And the second is using engaging pedagogies which connect the student to the knowledge. Something my colleagues and I are interested in is developing the curriculum design coherence model as such a design tool in order to create this knowledge-rich idea of the epistemic structure of rational knowledge. Now, what sort of knowledge do I mean? Well, I don't want to spend too much time on this, simply to say what I'm calling rational knowledge or propositional knowledge is known variously as science, disciplinary, subject knowledge, knowledge that, objective knowledge, and so on. The main idea is that it consists of mental thoughts, thought objects, thought products, the term Karl Popper uses, but it is product, not process. It's not the process of thinking, it's the end, it's the product that comes from the thought. Its purposes are predictive, explanatory, generative, and importantly, and I'm going to come back to this again, it is knowledge that, which means the idea is connected to the object of the idea, that connection of the concept to content. This type of rational knowledge is produced by individuals and disciplinary communities according to accepted procedures of testing and critique. And its power is in that generalizability and universalizability. Now, generalizability is an absolutely vital idea in what I'm talking about. Generalizability is activated in connecting the data and the object, or we could say in connecting the concept and the content, or connecting the mental and the material. I'm using the term that comes from Gilbert Ryle and is also used by Chris Winch, the term knowledge that, for this propositional knowledge, this rational knowledge that has the thought-matter connection, the concept-content connection. And that idea proposes a connection between the mental and the material. Now, that is one that Plato recognized as central. Plato talked about propositional knowledge coming about by the mind giving its beliefs, its thoughts, sufficient evidence, that connection to the material world. Immanuel Kant, once again, picked up that same idea that rational knowledge is not just located in the mind, but it is the mind being able to generalize its thoughts to the particular, to the instance. He talked about thoughts without content are empty. Now, universality is absolutely critical to the connection of rational knowledge and democracy, but it follows from generalizability. So disciplinary concepts are universalizable because they're generalizable. The generalizability comes first. Now, that is in contrast to socio-cultural knowledge, which is the type of knowledge, which is everyday knowledge, which arises from and serves the particular. The particular could be some sort of social group, perhaps an ethnic group, a religious group, community group of some sort, or ideological interests. Now I want to turn to the concept of collective representations. Now, collective representations, which is Durkheim's term, Bourdieu calls it consensus, it's the shared reality, it's how a society sees itself. It's the knowledge that a society uses in order to present itself to itself, to represent itself. Different types of knowledge serve as the collective representations for different types of society. Now, modern pluralist societies' collective representations are rational concepts that enable that generalization and universalization I mentioned. They individualize at the same time they socialize. So they socialize individuals into social relationships. So our social relationships are experienced subjectively, but we are also able, because we are being individualized, to look at those relations objectively. And once we're able to look at them objectively, they become open to critique by the individual. And at that point, this important concept of partial loyalty comes into play, that we are connected to our group, the group that we live in subjectively, but we are also able, through our ability to generalize, because of the rational knowledge we've acquired in the education system, we are able to sit back from those experiences, that subjectivity, to critique it, to consider it as the object of our generalized thoughts. Now, in contrast, traditional and neo-traditional societies, their collective representations are created in kin, ethnic, religious, caste, socio-cultural relations. They are the means to stabilize the group. So the knowledge of the group's experiences are non-generalizable, they're non-universalizable. And the purpose is to create a total loyalty. A person is socialized as a member of the group, not as an individual who can be partially loyal to the group. Now, this is where a fundamental contradiction arises in the collective representations that are created using rational knowledge. Because I've mentioned earlier how these collective representations contain simultaneously the instrument of thought, which is the individualizing mechanism, and the means of communication, the socializing mechanism. These are ideas that come through from Durkheim and others. But this means of communication, this socializing mechanism, what type of socializing? Is it democratic or is it non-democratic? And here we move into the potential of that contradiction has, that strife of the dialectic. So the structures of both rational knowledge, that structure of it being subjective and objective, of the mental and the material, and the structures in democracy, which I'll mention in a minute in the next slide, they both contain inherent contradictions. Now, those contradictions open up the fissures to enable criticism and change, and that is the potential for democracy. That is the potential for the link between rational knowledge and democracy. Those contradictions in the democratic political system, I've written about them in this chapter and I've written about them elsewhere, so I'm not going to discuss them here, but they are contradictions in the three structuring institutions of the democratic polity. The contradictions in the nation itself, it is both the people the actual people and the symbol of the people, the state, simultaneously the capitalist state and the democratic state and the citizen, the free person, the free political agent, and the classed worker. Huge contradictions built into the very structure of those institutions. And I'm arguing that that is the potential, where potential exists. It exists in contradiction. Then, in rational knowledge itself, we also see a main contradiction, two major contradictions. The contradiction occurs in knowledge that is in that connection of the mental and the material, concept and the content, the idea and the instant, that I referred to as knowledge that earlier on. Also, any of those terms, propositional knowledge, rational knowledge, and so on. Now, the contradiction in knowledge also exists in what I'm calling the meeting site of knowledge and society. Now, it's here that those collective representations created using rational knowledge come into play. So the instrument of thought, that individualizing mechanism, the means of communication, that socializing mechanism. So here you have another site for contradiction. Now, the question is, why would a rationalized individual choose democracy? Because it's not automatic that if you are educated, you are interested in democracy. So the rationalized individual is socialized into collective representations which see the material world in a certain way. And in the material world, I mean both the natural world and the social world. That rationality enables people to see the material world according to a universal criteria. That is the function of the generalizability and universalizability of rational knowledge. That link, being connected in the link of the mental and the material. The rationalized individual also has dispositions which can cope with the contradictions in the components of democracy structuring and institutions. Where does the individual get that ability to cope with contradiction from? From a curriculum of rational knowledge. And I talked about how rational knowledge has this quality of contradiction inherent to it. Now, what is the actual mechanism which activates the connection between rational knowledge and democracy? It is the disposition of partial loyalty, that mechanism of connection. Partial loyalty, when we are educated in rational knowledge, that enables us to live in the strife of the dialectic, to live in contradiction. We are able to belong to society, and at the same time we are able to critique it. We are partially loyal. We are able to live subjectively in the society, and we are able to objectify it, see its faults, see its qualities. In contrast, total loyalty, that disposition of total loyalty, is required by communitarian societies. Any society that is based on autocracies, on neo-traditionalist, non-democratic means of structuring power. And that total loyalty is created in the naturalized and uncriticized collective representations of sociocultural knowledge, in beliefs and in ideologies, in other words. So what are the features of rational knowledge which may connect it to democracy? That predictive quality of rational knowledge. Access to that knowledge creates future-oriented dispositions needed to think about what might be the political dimension, what should be the moral dimension. created in the ability to predict and hypothesize. Now, we can only do that if we have the ability to generalize, and that's where rational knowledge is the cornerstone, is the bedrock of being able to proceed to the morality, to the political dispositions required for democracy. So that generalized concept is not enough, though. It must be connected to the material, because the political, the social world is the material world. And this is where rational knowledge creates a partially loyal disposition. So there's a loyalty to the general and loyalty to the particular, but it's partial. We can critique both the idea and the enactment of the idea. So to conclude, I would have to argue, I would want to argue that there is a connection between rational knowledge and democracy, a necessary connection, a causal connection, but I am unable to argue that there is no causal, no necessary connection between rational knowledge and democracy, but neither is there a necessary connection, a causal connection between rational knowledge and non-democracy. But what democracy has, democracy is not possible without the features only produced in rational knowledge. They are the features I've talked about, the generalizable concepts that are universalizable, and that those partially loyal dispositions that come from that type of knowledge. So only a national education system can provide everyone with access to the collective representations which produce the rationalized thinker and that partially loyal citizen. So there is a strong likelihood that such an education will enable the knowledge democracy connection, but only if those conditions are met. So, there's hope there. Now, I've only been able to do the most basic overview of what is a really complex argument that starts from that proposition that of the potentiality of a connection. But I've developed it in a number of works, including in the chapter that we're in the book that we're discussing in these conversations. So as I finish, I would like to thank very much those who have organized these conversations, because it's a wonderful opportunity to talk about something as important as what is needed, what type of thinking, what type of knowledge is needed for democracy. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Professor Elizabeth Rata, for this brilliant presentation. Wonderful ideas about partial loyalty and the role of rational knowledge in democracy. Now it's a time for a conversation, a discussion between you and Professor Rohit Dhankar. So I would like Rohit Dhankar to appear on the screen. It's all magic now, so that you both could kind of have an engaging conversation with each other. Thank you. And after that, we'll have time for questions from the participants here, the audience here. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Rata. I remember listening to you, this and perhaps another paper, and I still remember one sentence which I have used several times, and it seems that you are talking on those lines, at least in some of your comments, that epistemic emancipation is a necessary condition for political emancipation. And I remember that generating a string of questions in that particular presentation. My paper is also actually basically on those lines, and I agree with most of what you are saying. I have one or two maybe clarification. I may not have got those ideas properly. we will start the conversation with one or two clarifications. Uh, when you talk of socio-cultural knowledge, uh, the manner this is described and rational knowledge, which is generalizable and universalizable, and I assume that in generalizing and universalizing, justification based on, uh, because you are also talking of connection with the material world, therefore justification based on uh, the the qualities of material and observational things. So it's coming from that side. Uh, One question which occurred to my mind in this connection was that uh, if we take sociocultural knowledge as you defined, that is belonging to a society or community, how would we distinguish between uh, knowledge and belief system of people? Uh, there have to be some kind of criteria which can distinguish between what I know and what I believe, and everything I believe, perhaps I cannot claim that I know. So, uh, what would be the criteria for? I can understand, I can or at least guess the criteria for calling something rational knowledge. What would be the criteria for calling something socio-cultural knowledge as against simply socio-cultural beliefs? So that is one clarification which perhaps would be useful for me. I do not know about the audience. Second, I like this idea of partial loyalty. To not to take too much of time, can we say that no rational knowledge prepares a person to be encultured or be educated in a culture, and also uh, gives the capability to, in a certain sense, transgress that culture and actually turn back and interrogate it? Can we call it reflective consciousness? And perhaps that mm, this is a necessity for us to living in a community and in a society, and therefore what we call socio-cultural knowledge is essential for us. But at the same time, uh, we might question that and turn back. So can we call it reflective consciousness as an epistemic agent? So these two clarification would be useful to me. Mm, Personally, I liked your presentation very much, and it seems to me that we are talking on more or less similar lines.
Yes, gosh, we are, and it's really wonderful to be able to talk, for us to talk together, because these ideas really matter. You know, the phrase you use, which I began my chapter with, that wonderful phrase of yours, curriculum frameworks in search of a coherent epistemology. Brilliant, loved it, and I've used it, and I mention it to my students as well. This idea that if we are going to educate each generation in democratic nations, we have to we have to know what rational knowledge is. What knowledge are we actually teaching them? And when you talked about in search of a coherent epistemology, that in a way sparked the idea which has led to the development of what my colleagues and I call the curriculum design coherence model. And that model is very much based on the notion of the epistemic structure, which links together the idea and the content, and avoids the problem of the curriculum simply just being a list of content, you know, the rote learning of lots and lots of content, as well as avoids the other problem, which could be that the curriculum is just a lot of big concepts, just a lot of big ideas. It's getting that coherence. So this is a wonderful opportunity to thank you for just nudging me in the direction of the coherent curriculum. And it's developed further with the Knowledge Rich project. Now I'll address both your points of clarification. The first one which is the distinction between belief and knowledge. I use Plato. I go back to Plato's dictum, the idea that knowledge is justified belief. So in a way, all knowledge is, we start from an idea or belief, an assumption, an opinion,
Yeah.
but it's what we do with it at that point. Now, socio-cultural knowledge is the sort of knowledge that we need just to live in the everyday world. We don't want to keep critiquing it. We have to believe it in order to be able to live. So it's not so much unjustified belief, but it's belief that does not need to be justified. It just is the belief, we need to live. And it gives the psychological security and enables the group to be a cohesive group. But rational knowledge requires that justification. It's justified belief or justified thought. And it's the process of justification, which is what you were talking about. And I enjoyed that your talk very much. Justified belief is when we can see past ideologies, we can expose those ideologies, that political correctness you talked about. You have to justify it. Now, Plato also used the term with sufficient evidence. Now, I would say that the sufficient evidence could be really good logic as well as actual evidence from the material world. But that's that connection between the idea and the justification of the idea in some type of evidence, whether it's logic that provides evidence or whether it's evidence from the material world. Now, the point about partial loyalty, I like this concept of partial loyalty very much, and I first used it in I came across it in Alan McFarlane's wonderful book, The Making of the Modern World. And I picked it up from there and I developed it in my 2012 book, Politics of Knowledge and Education. And I want to go back to it because as I was preparing for this talk, I realized the importance of partial loyalty as being the political disposition that contains the inherent contradiction to connect to the contradiction in rational knowledge. You use the term reflective consciousness. Absolutely right. Yes, I'd agree totally. Partial loyalty enables us to be both in the society and to objectify the society and to critique it. And that's why it's so difficult being modern, in modernity, because we want the security and safety of belonging, but we also want the freedom of being able to critique and then change.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for your questions. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to clarify those points.
Thank you. That I'm not sure, but that triggers another thought. This is just a comment. This also triggers another thought in my mind, that socio-cultural knowledge makes one a member of one's community. Now, while you are through rational knowledge, and if there is some sort of moral commitment to human well-being, then perhaps leads one towards the Aurobindo's idea of universal humanity. By that, I mean that since certain ideas are universal in the rational knowledge, therefore you can critique your own community and practices as well as beliefs of your own community, as well as your own behavior in your community, from a more universalized humanitarian perspective. That's just a comment. That's a thought triggered in my mind.
I mean, that's very true. If you do belong to a socio-cultural group that has a morality which is like that, sadly, many social groups are very inward-looking, and in fact, in order to maintain their social cohesion and the loyalty of their members, will in fact accentuate the differences that the group has with others. So it can, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. you have to rely on whether that group has a morality of love and harmony, but that can't be taken for granted. It could be the other way as well.
Okay.
But with, democracy, because democracy is based on the principle of the universal human being, not the principle of the member of a group, that premise, that basic principle means that its values come from that principle rather than the serendipity of maybe, the social group does have fine morals.
Yeah. So I do not have many more comments. Also, the time we have taken almost an hour in total. So perhaps Ajita would like to put forward some questions if there are any. Conversation, of course, can go on, Ajita, but perhaps we need to give some time if there are any questions. If no questions, of course, that's.
Yeah. So I think we have about 35 minutes more, and we can take questions from audience also. Maybe I'll also seed in some questions here. A couple of questions that I have in my mind, especially for Professor Rohit Dhankar, in the context of this idea of epistemic and moral truth and rational knowledge per se, right? So when you speak of justice, the way both of you have used rational knowledge is almost domain neutral, right? You've not spoken of rational knowledge in any particular domain. My question is, given that science and mathematics has rapidly progressed in the last few centuries, what kind of domain requires greater progress? I mean, within the idea of rational knowledge, for justice to become a central concern of human beings. So that's my first question. If both of you can take it and answer it.
Could you repeat it? I couldn't get it properly. The last part. What exactly is your question? Yeah.
Yeah. So my question exactly is that that rational knowledge has really kind of operated itself in mathematics and sciences, and we have progressed a lot in mathematics and sciences, but that has not necessarily led to a world that is just for everybody, right? So what kind of domain that you think should progress now, along with science and mathematics, so that justice also becomes a central concern of human beings?
Can I pick up that point first, Roy? I would say that rational knowledge is value free, neutral, in that it is truth seeking. It's not the truth, and the issue of justice, of values, of morality, lies in the political sphere, and that's the problem, because how do you connect rational knowledge, which is simply a means to understand the world, with the way we should be in the world? And the should be is the sphere of morality, of issues of justice and so on. And they are political concerns. And this is why science must be under the control of ethics, because science itself is simply science. It does its thing. It seeks the truth according to its disciplinary concepts, but it doesn't have any inherent desire for justice or for morality within it. That has to be imposed upon it. And of course, we know throughout the industrial age that the ethics of science weren't perhaps to the fore in people's minds as they are now. Now we are very concerned about how science should serve humanity. But I see them as different spheres.
Extending on the same points a little bit. I would say that rational knowledge has not developed only in science and mathematics. I do believe that in social sciences and other fields also, rational knowledge doesn't necessarily mean concern with empirical. Even when we talk of mathematics, we are already talking going beyond just the empirical in that sense. So that's one part. But connecting it to justice, yes, you have to connect it with ethics and somehow with the human consciousness, where concern for others' well-being enters into it. Uh, I have been thinking, also looking for literature and a definite connection between rational thinking and concern for others' well-being, which could be logically, ironclad logic you can build. Uh, Personally, I am not certain, but it seems to me that the reciprocity and our experiences in upbringing when others look after our well-being, somehow that becomes part of our consciousness at a very deep level. So they connect together. Rational knowledge tells me what kind of impact my actions are going to be on others, and my concern for well-being and my judgment how they are going to feel and suffer or enjoy that. These two things, when come together, perhaps a kind of connection is forged, but I will not be able to explain. This is also partly the cognitive science and psychological issue. I wouldn't be able uh, to give a detailed and ironclad logic for it. But it seems to me rooted in reciprocity uh, mm, and the care shown to us in our upbringing from the very early age. This connection has to be forged. Rational knowledge alone, there seems to be a sometimes what people say a gap, and one has to leap over it.
Yes, I certainly agree with that. You can be highly educated, a really rational person, and a really horrible person. Your morality is not necessarily connected, and it's finding a way to make the connection is my interest, because it's
Yeah,
not a causal connection.
that's right.
Thank you. So you would say that that the commitment to human well-being and justice is also a rational commitment.
Uh, if you take, I would say that if you take certain assumptions, then it becomes rational commitment. Uh, Usually, this is not very well argued academic line, but usually the line I take is that if we recognize that our being human is actually dependent on our being in relationship with other human beings. Otherwise, we would have been biologically human, but not culturally and in terms of sensitivity as we are. Then our very existence of becoming human depends on other human beings. And this gives at least a toehold, if not very compel. It cannot compel us in that direction, but it does give a toehold for being concerned for other human beings. So rationally, one can defend it. Negative side, not being concerned with other human beings, uh, mm, and still being human. Actually, that would be difficult to human in this sense would be difficult to argue for. So therefore, maybe not an ironclad justification, but there is an indication, at least in my mind, it seems to be. I do not know what Professor Rata thinks about it.
Well, idea of the idea of the human being is a very recent idea. I mean, it's a very modern idea. Traditionally, people saw themselves as members of a particular group, and we see with the rise of neo-traditionalism in the last, since the 1970s, a return by many people to the what they feel is is a deeper security, the security of a romantic, offered by a very romanticized view of what the past was, that they get a sense of belonging from going back to the historical group, and that idea of being a member of the human race is one that many are rejecting today, which is of great concern, because we can't have democracy unless we have that concept of the universal human being.
Mhm.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Rata and Professor Dhankar. So there are some questions also on the chat. I think we can take them up. So I might read out one. So this is from Saubhagya Verma, and she says that in India, political ideologies are largely family influenced. Sometimes
Largely?
family influenced,
Okay.
they're influenced by families,
Mm.
sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly. No matter how much knowledge is gained externally, the ingrained beliefs, biases, likeness, etc., they don't really change. It makes having harmony in society difficult. How would the current quote unquote knowledge sharing system need to be modified in order to have more objective quote unquote partially loyal citizens?
Mm. Well, I think it's that. Oh, sorry. Rohit, can I pick this one up?
Yeah, please,
Please,
please.
I think it's the socializing function that goes with the individualizing function in the education system. And it's a socializing into rational knowledge. The family, there's the sociocultural knowledge, of course, deeply ingrained, naturalized. So the modern human being requires both types of knowledge, that sociocultural knowledge, which is deeply ingrained, and a lot of morality comes there. But if we have national education systems which take young people right through, 12, 13 years, and in those systems, they engage with rational knowledge, which simultaneously individualizes them and socializes them into a universal humanity. Then we end up living with the contradiction that, the pressures of our family and what we have learned at school, and sometimes they don't go together. And that's where we have to use judgments. And that judgment that we have to make about how we should live is a judgment informed both by the prejudices we acquire at home and maybe the good morality we acquire at home, but also the ability to think objectively at school. And how do we make judgments when we've got these conflicting forces impose, requiring us to make judgments, and sometimes we make the right judgments and sometimes we don't. We give in to our prejudices.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. Only it seems to me that while developing rational knowledge, we already talked several times about it, you also get the insight into your own functioning of your ideas and your mind. And that may help up to a certain extent in examining the views and attitudes and dispositions you acquired, what the Kathis would call in an analyzed without rationally examining that sort of thing, and at a certain time you can think about that. I'm somewhat uncomfortable with this idea of uh, mm, of contradiction. Yes, we do have tension between belonging to a community and the universal ideas, but whether that is a perpetual contradiction in contradiction in the sense unresolvable, I'm not certain at this moment. It seems to me that through the development of mind, one can actually mm, mitigate this contradiction if cannot completely resolve, and therefore you are able to look at the welfare and well-being of your own community and yourself within that community. You can find a way of being your welfare consistent with the welfare of all human beings or well-being of all human beings. Yes, there is a tension and constant striving for that. Sometimes I call it expanding your consciousness to include the other into it, and maybe that has a kind of direction, which is direction of our development as human beings. I don't know. I mean, it's not something which could be resolved in uh, short time.
Thank you. The next question is from Aruna Bajantri. This is to Professor Rohit Dhankar. So she wants to ask, I want to ask, what measures do you suggest for curbing the rising harmful kind of political correctness? For it is quite clear that people who make politically correct claims have self-interesting or self-interested objectives and are aware of the political harm of their claims.
I don't know. You see, I'm more of a teacher, and rather than a politician. So, what would work? I don't know. I can theoretically and can see uh, that that this is an unfortunate trend. The only thing I have a faith in, and I do believe that Professor Rata might share that faith partially, that our development as rational being and seeing impact of our actions and thoughts helps us inch towards, if not in leaps, then inching towards right kind of decisions. So I don't see any other way other than having a calm, rational discourse in the society. It seems to me that if our debates, political debates in the society become more coherent and rational, and we start listening to each other rather than only listening to ourselves, we may move. It will take a long time, but we may move towards a right kind of direction slowly. I'm absolutely certain, and here I do not know, since I'm that there always be some people in the society who will sacrifice the greatest common good of the society for their own either ideology or community or ideological commitments, and for that you require majority on the right path to keep them under control as well as look after their well-being as well. So I'm giving a woolly answer, Aruna. I don't have a pakka answer to that.
Thank you.
Yes, no, I'd agree with what you've said. That I mean, that is why we are committed to education for young people, because we believe that education does humanize us. I mean, why bother to have schools if we don't believe that? Oh, I mean, we could have schools that simply have an instrumentalized curriculum, just skills and. But we have an idea that knowledge is much more than just skills and competencies. And why do we have that? Because we believe that it has a humanizing potential, but it's a potential only. And the hope is that the more we are able to think rationally, i.e., to think outside of ourselves, the more we may commit to a morality that is also greater than ourselves. And that is the hope of education systems. I think that if you're, as a teacher, if you don't have some sort of faith in the humanizing power of knowledge, of rational knowledge, then it would be very difficult to be a teacher.
Yeah,
I would entirely agree with you on that.
Thank you. The next question is from Maitreyi Kumaraswamy. She's asking, isn't founding justice based on rational knowledge somehow limiting? Aren't there many instances or evidences that may not be conducive to logic or the material world, but still intuitively make sense with respect to the context? How do we even begin to consider these?
I'm sorry, I did not understand it. So maybe if Professor Rata takes that up and maybe in her explaining, I may understand it. I didn't understand it
I would
properly.
take the word justice and say justice involves judgment. Judgment involves having criteria, separating out judgment from preference. Judgment involves making decisions based on criteria that you know. You have worked out why I am making this judgment. And I'm making this judgment because I believe that it is just. That the judgment can be seen for what it is. People can look at the judgment, they can see my reasons for it, the criteria I've used. So my claim that this judgment is for justice can be put to the test. But preference, on the other hand, is when you don't have to give criteria for your opinion or what you've decided to do, the judgment you've made. And, you know, if you're not going to if you don't have to stand up and be counted for the reasons for your judgment, then I would be a bit worried about the judgment. You know, sometimes it might be the right judgment, but if anyone was passing judgment on me, I would like to know the criteria for that judgment, and to say what the criteria is means you have to objectify it. You can't just say it's a feeling I have. So that would be my comment.
Yeah, I would add only 2 sentences to it. Justice is a social concept. This is not something like mercy or daya or kindness, which is, of course, directed towards other, but at the same time, my own expresses my own feeling. Justice being social means the other is necessarily involved uh, as a party, and therefore my personal feeling and opinion alone is quite inadequate to even define justice. It seems to me that justice can be defined only rationally. There is no way of defining justice only on the basis of intuition and feeling. By the way, intuition sometimes have reasons which are unexplicated or unarticulated. So sometimes our intuitive feel, actually, when we analyze, might reveal some rational grounds for it, though it's not always necessary. So it seems to me that justice is quite impossible to define without recourse to reason.
Thank you. So Indu Periodi asks a question. It's a clarification that she is seeking on the difference between socio-cultural knowledge and socio-cultural beliefs. So anybody ready to clarify that?
Yes, I can pick that up easily. Well, there's no difference. It's the same thing. Socio-cultural knowledge is the knowledge of experience. It includes our behavior, our beliefs, it's known variously as folk knowledge, everyday knowledge, knowledge of experience. Vygotsky calls it spontaneous knowledge. It ranges from everything from spoken language through to being able to ride a bike, to how I behave, to my beliefs. It's all the knowledge that enables us to just live without having to justify everything all the time. When we go shopping, we don't want to have to think all the time, how do I justify buying all this chocolate? You know, we just do it. It's living in the world. So knowledge, sociocultural knowledge is belief. It's the way I live. Yeah. And you don't want to be judged. not too strongly.
The only thing is that I will hesitate to call it knowledge. I would call it beliefs which do not always require justification to live a happy life.
Yeah, which is a good point. Yes. And using the word knowledge, it is, it
Sometimes beliefs which cannot be justified. For example, my colleagues and friends and my wife and children love me. It's very good. They are very good beliefs. I wouldn't like to have justifications for that.
Yeah, I suppose I'm using knowledge in the widest sense possible. Is that simply it's knowledge about how to live from day to day? Yeah. That's a good question. Thank you for that.
Thank you. I think here is a provocative comment from Vinod Trivedi. Vinod Trivedi says that humanity owes all its growth to very few people, not to the masses. So I repeat, humanity owes all its growth to very few people, not to the masses. The masses have been the hindrance. They are like rocks preventing the growth of society. So in the context of democracy, that every human being has rationality and dignity, how would you respond to this?
Wow. Well, I suppose objectively it's true that, it is a few people who have led the fight for a better world, but I think that many people haven't, because they have been so brutally oppressed and haven't been able to. That could veer very much to the idea of, an elite, and most people are ignorant, and therefore, no, my view of humanity is perhaps a bit more optimistic. I see that many, many more people will have wanted to better their lives if they had not been oppressed. You just think of women throughout the ages. I mean, it wasn't for lack of wanting a better life. It was just too difficult. And that's that socio-cultural, culture, the tyranny of culture. So it's probably true that a few people have led the way, but I would say that, give credit to all those who would have wanted to have been there too, to fight the good fight as well.
I also would add that this might be true that we have the historical record of very few people in terms of either developing knowledge or ideas or moral values, discourses on moral values, and also actions. But whether these people created these ideas and actions alone, or whether the larger humanity, whom Vinod Trivedi is calling hindrance, they contributed substantially to their development. I'm not saying definitely directly, but their life experiences analyzed by some people contributed to it. I think that also have to be considered. I would have a more optimistic view of humanity than that. It seems to me that the people who are visible, they are collecting and analyzing the total human experience, and many people who have not been visible may have actually might have added a lot to it. So just by historical record and visibility in a certain society, I don't think we can come to that conclusion. We all are striving together, and some of us you can call torch bearers, but I don't think others didn't contribute. I do not know. I feel somewhat uncomfortable with that, but cannot pinpoint it very well.
And maybe the rocks holding us back are the tyrants, the dictators, the autocrats, the ones we know in the world today who are ensuring that they limit their people. So,
Yeah.
Interesting question. Very interesting question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Vinod. It may not be my place to speak. I think that kind of raises the question of who is the author of a thought or an action, right? There may not be a single author, though a single author is labeled for a thought or an action, but the author's voice itself may just be an expression of a collective consciousness that emerges at any given point in time and space. Yeah. Thank you for the response to that. So we don't have questions coming on the chat right now. I'm just waiting for more people to add their questions. So in the meantime, I may kind of extend this conversation because the term faith came up a few times in our conversation here, but I want to place the term faith a little differently. So it is kind of at least one stream or one strand of argument is that in the Christian tradition or the Christian tradition's influence on education, that reason also was very, very closely tied with faith. It was used to intellectualize faith so that Christianity could defend against attacks from other religions and other philosophical perspectives. So, in the idea of rationality and reason, how do you see the place of faith in the context of religious faith here? Because you also raised Aurobindo, so I wanted to really understand that. Both of you can please answer to this.
Well, I see religion and belief as belonging to the socio-cultural sphere, and that rationality could damage religion. I mean, we don't want, if we have beliefs in a certain religion, we actually don't want to critique it. We have religious beliefs because those beliefs make us part of a community. They give us comfort. They give us psychological security. There are reasons for those beliefs. So I see beliefs as that a type of knowledge that belongs in the socio-cultural world. But rational knowledge doesn't fit with religion because rational knowledge requires doubt. And if you want to believe, if you want to have a religion, you don't want to doubt the religion. The very point of religion is not to doubt. And science is all about doubt. So I think it's possible for people to hold both types of knowledge in themselves. When you do see it, you see scientists who are also quite religious, but they keep the two types of knowledge separate. And I think that's perhaps the way to do it. One is all about doubt and critique, and the other is about not doubting, not critiquing, but believing. And maybe we need both. Some individuals do, and I think that's fine.
I don't think the idea of a region developed out of Christian faiths need to defend itself against another religions. That would confine region to the Christendom. I think many of you, including you, Ajita, know Janardhan Ganeri's book. I have forgotten its name just now. But in Indian tradition, region and rationality is as old as the philosophy started. It seems to me that in Veda, that Sukt, in which there is doubt who started this world and whether there is anyone who started it or not, who knows. I think this doubt is actually striving for some kind of rational ground to make sense of the world. So, reason as a tendency to make sense of the world in the cognitive realm, I think this is a universal human trait. It has got nothing to do with this religion or that religion. That's part one. Part two, there is quite developed form of, of religion. Actually, if you look at, you can give hundreds of examples, but if you look at the opening of the Nyaya Darshan, I think it's an extremely rational kind of opening from that point of view, which tells you what knowledge is and what knowledge can do for you. Similarly, uh, uh, I think I agree with Professor Rata entirely that faith actually doesn't require reason. Faith is something in which you 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 just you just accept that. You, as soon as your faith requires reason, it seems that the faith is not adequate. Faith itself is not adequate. Therefore, you want something more than that. Now, this is possible that we all require faith in something or other up to a certain extent. For example, a rationalist may require within quote a certain kind of reliance upon the rational capability of human being, and the region itself may not be able to lift itself from its own bootstraps to put in very firm ground that this is the right path. So, from if even if you interpret faith in that sense, uh, even then the faith in reason, I mean within court faith in reason, would constantly is being challenged and rationalized from that point of view. So I'm not certain that faith has such a great connection. However, historically, faith has been obstructing the development of reason quite often in all cultures, all religions, and obstructing now in the world actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
India is a playground of faith trying to dominate region right now.
Yeah, that's very true. Maybe we also need a more nuanced understanding of what faith itself is. I tend not to think of faith as just blind acceptance in that sense of the term, or just holding a belief in that sense of the term. But we could talk about it a little later. We are also running out of time. There is one question from Lavanya Murli. I'm trying to understand the question. So she says, if science provides evidence for forming criteria in justice, then would justice be based on rational knowledge rather than only in the political sphere or a social agreement?
Well, the problem is that science cannot define justice. If you have a solid definition of justice, which may have some kind of empirical indicators, then science may help you uh, to say something whether justice exists in this community or in this place or not. But the definition of justice or what justice is, there is a, at least it seems to be that the gap between is and ought seems to be unbridgeable to me at this moment. This is a kind of desirability. This is a kind of what we ought to be doing. If I again go to Dewey, then he would say that science describes the world as it is, and philosophy actually tries to arrive at what kind of dispositions we ought to have that world which is defined by science. And justice comes in that ought to have area. So I'm doubtful whether science can give us any criteria for defining justice. I don't know how Professor Rata thinks about it.
Yes, I suppose that's quite a restricted view of the word science. If we talked about rational knowledge being not just empirical science, but it being philosophy, it being able to think about ourselves, then it would include justice, because we would think about, the concepts of what justice is, what its purpose is, the type of society it serves, the criteria for enacting justice. I mean, they all require, all those ideas require reasons. You know, you have to reason through it. Yeah, so that would be the only comment I'd make. It's getting rather late here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we have almost run out of time now. There are no more questions on the chat. So I really wholeheartedly thank you both for joining us today in this very, very enlightening and engaging discussion. There is quite a lot that I learned from both of you. I'm sure a lot of our participants have also benefited from this conversation. As I would just reiterate that as I began saying that all of these conversations are again meant to bring philosophical thought back into the educational landscape, which is constantly shrinking. And we've seen that shrinking both in the academia and in the practice spaces. So we look at the primacy of philosophy here, then to bring this in the educational discourse also. There's just one final announcement for our viewers. You can actually go to this portal called Philosophy of Education, set up by Azim Premji University, http poe.azimpremjiuniversity.in, and you can download the book from there that we have released, putting together all the conference proceedings, um, and you can also leave questions to us through our email contact that is given there, right? So thanks a lot for joining us today. Thank you, Professor Elizabeth Rata, for joining us from New Zealand. Thank you, Professor Dhankar, for joining us from Jaipur, if I'm not wrong.
Yes.
So yeah, good to see you all here today. Okay, take care. Have a good weekend. Bye, and hope by the end of this weekend the